and welcome. My name is Ole Norberg. I'm Director General of the Swedish National Space Board. And I would also like to extend a warm welcome from our partners that we have been working with to arrange this seminar. It is the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering, IVA, and the Swedish Governmental Agency for Innovation Systems, Vinnova. And we are very grateful for their support in arranging this seminar. Today, IVA is represented by Camilla Köbe. Where are you? There. Please feel that we have really been taken well care of by IVA in getting this arranged here at their premises. We also have Maria Dahl Torjesson from Vinnova. Maria, Vinnova has arranged for this to be broadcast on the web, so this seminar is on the web in real time. Since April this year, Christer Fuglesang is back in Sweden, working both for the Swedish National Space Board and KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, as well as being an ESA employee. One of the things that we decided very early on was to arrange a series of seminars together with Christer, where we use Christer as the implementing part really to help Swedish space community and to inspire us to take new steps into the future. And today we will experience the first of this kind of seminars, the topic being entrepreneurship and space today. And very timely, I would like to announce that earlier today, just before lunch, I sent in an application to the ESA Director General requesting the establishment of an ESA Business Incubation Center in Sweden. This is something I believe will have a great impact on entrepreneurship and space in Sweden. That being said, I also would like to introduce our moderator for today, Ulf Wikebom. Ulf. And with that, I hand over to Christer.
Thank you, Ove. Thank you very much. It's nice to see so many people here. I think we had exactly 100 on the list of participants. And this is such a sunny Monday afternoon. It might not be easy to get a lot of people here. I think we have a very exciting program, and recapitulate a little bit how it will look like. So first we'll have our keynote speaker, who I'll soon give a much more detailed introduction to. And then we have a 20 minutes coffee break, I guess 20 minutes, 25, but you better make sure you're back in time. And then we'll have a kind of a short, interesting presentations of some very entrepreneurial people, which we'll discuss together and found. And they will be introduced one by one, I guess, by Ulf when it comes to that, if that's correct. Yeah. I won't go through that. But between the talks, then there will be about 15-20 minutes discussion with another panel who will ask these guys, and I guess we'll also might go possibilities for the audience, anybody can pose a question, depending on how nice the moderator is. So with that said, oh yeah, and then I want to say that towards the end, there is a mingle out there where the rymdstyrelsen, Swedish National Space Board, with some drinks and snacks, so you can all talk a little bit more with each other and with our presenters here. So with that, I would like to present our main speaker today. I'm very glad he can make it. It's a friend and NASA colleague of mine, Michael Lopez Alegria. He actually has a couple of American space records. He flew 3 times on a space shuttle, and then he was commander on one of the ISS expedition flights. I'd say you stay there for a long time. Actually, Mike spent more time than anyone and another American on ISS in one go, 215 days. And he was the commander on ISS when I was there visiting during my first flight, so it was really nice. He really helped us Everyone knows about this solar array problem, which happened when I was up there, and I think I was one of the key guys to figure out what was the problem and make sure we could solve it. But he's also, let's call it half European, born in Madrid, Spain, still has a Spanish passport, he showed me that one. But mainly grew up in California, then joined the US Navy, where he earned, was a master in science degree in aeronautical engineering, became a naval test pilot. He was the top lieutenant out of 60 in the largest school, aviation school they ever had, and he showed very good leadership, and I can really tell you that's true. And he's a graduate of Harvard University Kennedy School of Government Program for Senior Executives in National and International Security, so it's very impressive. But maybe more easy to understand is that he logged over 5,700 hours on more than 30 different aircrafts. He joined NASA in 1992, right? Actually, same year I joined ESA as an astronaut, so we kind of the same age in as astronaut. What I think I really envy him most is that he have had a chance to fly this kind of thing, which if you see in the movie Gravity, you see the the hero, he flies around like a kind of space moped. Mike actually, who goes by the name LA, but I'm friends by the way, he had a chance to test that kind of thing we have now on ISS for spacewalks, for safer. Must have been fun, huh? So, and then another record he has the second most spacewalks in the world, 10 spacewalks. There's only one Russian who has more. That's something else. But now, since March 2012, he is working as a president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. So he really know more of these things, which is really of a big, great interest for us all here today than almost anyone else. And with that, Mike, LA, please.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Krister. That's a little bit longer introduction than we needed, but it was a great pleasure to fly with you on orbit. A great astronaut, a great comrade, and we had a wonderful time up there. Sad to see you go, but you got a lot done while you were there. And thank you, Willie, and the Swedish National Space Board for this invitation, as well as the other sponsors. I'm very apologetic that I cannot deliver this talk in Swedish. It amazes me how well people speak English in this country. I felt embarrassed the other day. I actually asked somebody in a store, "Do you speak English?" And they looked at me sort of like, "Of course I speak English." I don't think you would get that in the U.S. if you asked somebody if they spoke Swedish or pretty much any other language. Anyway, I want to spend about half of my time talking about sort of the past and the present in human spaceflight, and then the last part talking about what I think is the future, which is the commercial spaceflight industry in the U.S. And Krister, I'm sure you could have delivered this first half as well as I can, but I'm speaking with the microphone, so let's begin. So the human spaceflight really started with an unhuman and sort of inhuman vehicle, the V-2 rocket. This is obviously used back at the end of World War II. It led quickly to the development of Sputnik, launched in October 4th, 1957. That really kicked off what is often called a space race, which then began the human part of it with this gentleman, Yuri Gagarin. He launched on Vostok on April 12th in 1961 as the first human not only to fly in space but also orbited the Earth. Not too much later, we had an American fly a suborbital flight, and a second one of those, and then this gentleman, John Glenn, flew his orbital flight in February of 1962, so almost a year later. Not long after that, President Kennedy delivered a very famous speech in Houston in September at Rice University, where he challenged the country to orbit, to get a man to land on the moon and bring him back safely within the decade. So I think this is sort of late 1962. That gave him a little bit more than 8 years, actually 7 years, if you want to count 1969 as the end of the decade. a pretty amazing challenge that he laid down for the country. So a few things had to be developed. One of them was the ability to do spacewalks. This is the very first one done by, again, a Russian. This is Alexei Leonov in April of 1965, and then just a couple of months later, Ed White did the same thing for the U.S. from a Gemini spacecraft. Gemini also was a program where they developed and refined the ability to do rendezvous in space. So they had to have two vehicles be able to approach and dock with each other in order to execute the Apollo missions. And then finally, Christmas in 1968 saw the first circumnavigation of the moon by Apollo 8 crew. This is a famous picture from on that mission that was taken on Christmas Eve, and they famously said that when he put his thumb up to the window, he completely covered the Earth. And then the moon landing was July 1969, of course. Then we had some cooperating times with the Soviets. This is the Apollo-Soyuz test program, which was an Apollo module that actually docked with a Soyuz module in 1975. Not very much is heard about this, but this is quite an event and really became the cornerstone of cooperation that later became part of the International Space Station program. And while the Russians were busy doing space stations, Salyut and then Mir, the U.S. Went to the space shuttle. So this is a pretty impressive vehicle. Not all of it is reusable, but everything but the external tank, what looks sort of the orange color is. It has over 500,000 gallons of propellant in two different tanks. The solid rocket boosters put out about 3.2 million pounds of thrust each. And the three main engines that are on the bottom of the space shuttle put out about 400,000 pounds each. So when you add it all up, it's about 7.5 million pounds of thrust on a vehicle that weighs about 4.5 million pounds. So that difference is the amount of G's that the crew feels at liftoff. What's interesting is that the vehicle's burning about 9 tons of propellant per second. So as you climb, you get lighter and lighter. The thrust remains about constant, so the G-forces increase up to about a little over 2 Gs. When the solid rocket boosters have burned out after about 2 minutes, they fall off, they land back in the ocean, and they're recovered. And then the rest of the vehicle continues to orbit. Obviously, the thrust decreases greatly when the solid rocket boosters are ejected. Goes back down to just over 1 G, and then it increases pretty linearly up to 3 Gs for the last minute, and then the engines are throttled back to maintain that. So I have a video that will show what that's like. I think I have to do this. Does that look about right, Krister?
I think so.
Okay, this is just a picture of the space shuttle in orbit, obviously without the tank or the solid rocket boosters. Payload bay doors are open. You can see the robotic arm is semi-deployed for operations. I'll talk a little bit more about what the space shuttle did most of the time when it was on orbit in just a second. But I'll talk about the end of the mission, which is a landing. So it's a pretty amazing vehicle in that it starts its reentry at a point, and I haven't, I can try to convert this in kilometers, but it's about 7,000 kilometers from the landing site at an altitude of about 400,000 feet, which is about the edge of the atmosphere, right around 60 kilometers. And it's a glider, so it has no engines. It's coming all the way back, and basically it's constantly measuring its energy state and adjusting its angle of bank in order to either increase the energy depletion rate or reduce it until the pilot takes over at about just subsonic, passing Mach 1, and comes in for a dead stick landing on the runway. This is obviously Kennedy Space Center. It's also landed several times at Edwards Air Force Base on the west coast of the United States, and once at a place in New Mexico, which is a backup landing site. So it touches down at about, it flies the outer glide slope at 300 knots. It touches down at about 200 knots, and it's a 15,000 foot runway, so it's plenty of room to stop even without the parachute. This is the last flight of Atlantis, which is the last flight of the space shuttle program in July of 2011. So as of right now, the United States has no capability to launch humans to orbit. So let's talk about the present now. The International Space Station is a cooperative project between 5 agencies of the world, space agencies of the world. In addition to NASA, there's the Russian Space Agency, Roscosmos, the European Space Agency, the Japanese, and the Canadian Space Agencies. And these countries or these agencies have gotten together to put this amazing piece of hardware in orbit, basically one piece at a time. So the first piece was launched in November of 1998 on an unmanned Proton rocket from Kazakhstan. It was put in an orbit of about 200 miles or so, and it waited for the next piece to be launched, which was an American piece inside the space shuttle. The crew did a rendezvous with the orbiting functional cargo block. That was the name of the Russian module. Reached out with its robotic arm to grab the Russian module and basically put the two modules together with its own that was in the payload bay of the shuttle, and once they let go, that began the construction. So this is what the construction would look like if you could watch a cartoon of it. You can look at the dates down in the bottom, and you'll see that they go from 1998 all the way up to 2011. And it took something like 50 plus flights, many EVAs, always done in pairs of 2 people at a time. So the normal routine, most of the flights were on the space shuttle, most of the elements came up in the space shuttle's cargo bay. And the normal routine was on the second day of the mission, the shuttle would dock to the space station. It would use its robotic arm to remove whatever the element is from the cargo bay and either hand it off to the space station's robotic arm or dock it or berth it directly to whatever the appropriate place was on the space station. And then usually a crew of 2 people would go out and do some kind of a spacewalk in order to make the connections. So electrical connections, hydraulic connections. Very often there were large pieces of what they called launch locks, so big structural elements that held things still in place that had to be unbolted and either removed or at least put in a different position. These spacewalks would usually last about 7 hours or so. And there were anywhere from 2 to up to 4. Actually, I think, Krister, on your flight, you actually performed 5 EVAs, correct? With Sunny. You did. Oh, okay. Right. Okay. So anyway, there were a lot of these flights over time, as you could see, and when I was on board was about halfway through the construction or so. It was 2006, 2007, so the station was already not this big. Right now it's larger than a soccer field. It weighs close to 500,000 or 500 tons and is on orbit as we speak with 6 people aboard. 3 of them just landed yesterday and doing operations 24/7. This is just a diagram of who the different players are, the pieces that were brought up by each agency. So I mentioned that the U.S. has no ability to get astronauts to the space station, so what we currently do is we contract with the Russians to fly on the Soyuz spacecraft. So the Soyuz spacecraft, if you imagine what the physics are to get into space, you have to accelerate to a certain velocity at a certain altitude. It's pretty much the same as a space shuttle, but this is a much smaller vehicle because it principally carries only crew. It doesn't really have any cargo carrying capacity. Now there's a cargo only version that looks a lot like this, that is unmanned obviously, and it does a similar kind of profile. But 2 days before launch it is rolled out. It's obviously horizontally integrated in a big hangar, rolled out on a train, and then erected 2 days before launch. This thing is launched more than any other human vehicle ever and has a wonderful safety record. I don't know about this guy down here on the right. I wonder if he got a sunburn. I have a sort of a home movie version of a Soyuz launch. Well, it doesn't look like it's going to play. Anyway, the sensations from inside are sort of similar to the space shuttle. The accelerations are about the same. It's a lot more smooth. The space shuttle, if you noticed in the first video where there was a lot of shaking, that's because the solid rocket boosters they burn unevenly. So it's a bit like driving a car down a railroad track. You sort of feel the bumps all the time. When the solid rocket boosters separate, then it becomes very smooth and just a very strong acceleration. The Soyuz is pretty much that way the whole way because it's liquid propellant only. This is what the vehicle actually looks like when the shroud's been off and the stages have dropped away. There are basically three parts here. This is the descent module, which is where the 3 crew members are. This is the habitation module, to which you can enter once you've reached orbit, and then from about here to the left is a propulsion module, which is unpressurized. It just has equipment and tanks and that sort of thing. And then to rendezvous with the space station, back in the day it was done also about 48 hours after launch. Lately they've been doing it only 6 hours, 4 orbits after launch. The result is that it's a little bit less efficient, and there are certain launch windows that are not available because of the phasing. But effectively, this is all automated. It does it by itself. If you can imagine, the unmanned version has to do the same thing. So the capability is there. Of course, if there's a problem, the crew can take over and fly manually, which has happened a couple of times. This is a view from inside, from a camera actually. The commander who is standing by to do the final docking is actually monitoring this through a periscope. Very sort of primitive, but very effective. So now I just have a few kind of fun videos about what's it like to live aboard the ISS. The first thing is that you don't walk around, you just fly. And it's an amazingly serene and peaceful feeling. We get a sleeping bag is attached usually inside a compartment that looks a little bit like a telephone booth. And you can see in this case, this is my crewmate Sonny Williams, who's sleeping vertically. You could put the sleeping bag on the ceiling or on the floor, put on your head down or heads up. It doesn't really matter, obviously. She's putting on slippers, but that's just to keep her feet warm because she's not going to be stepping on anything. A lot of people ask about hygiene. It's a little bit different in that we don't have running water, so water will form a floating ball, so you can't take a shower or wash your face. But in actual reality, you stay pretty clean up there. First of all, there's nothing to get you very dirty. But the only thing that you really need to shower from is exercise. We do a lot of exercise, about 2 to 2.5 hours every day. But things like brushing your teeth, we put a little bit of water to sort of make the toothpaste adhere, and then you just brush your teeth per normal. You've got to decide what you're going to do with the toothpaste when you're finished. Some people will, spit it into a napkin. A lot of people just swallow it because it's a little bit easier. This is the ASU, which is the Russian acronym for toilet. I thought I would show this so that you don't have to ask any questions about that later. This is how you urinate in it, pretty straightforward. It's just a funnel with a little bit of suction. That valve opens up, creates some suction. Pretty straightforward. The other part is a little bit more complicated, but the principles are pretty known to everybody. Most of the food comes up, it's either dehydrated or it's thermostabilized, which means it's in sort of a foil package that just needs to be reheated. And so typically somebody will be assigned to cook for the crew. When I say cook, I don't really mean there's not really much ingenuity involved. It's a question of putting things in the oven and adding water with this dispenser. The directions are right on it, tells you how much, hot or cold in case you don't know. And then once it's done, you sort of squish it together as I'm doing here, and in this case it becomes Mexican scrambled eggs. The drinks are also similarly rehydrated. It's usually just some kind of powder inside this foil container. You just shake it, and then you can normally put the straw in your mouth, but if you're on camera, you can sort of let it float. Not bad. And now drinking water, we can drink directly from a fountain or a source like Misha's doing here. This is the Russian crewmate, Misha Turin. You'd actually be on the other side of the room. And if you're really thirsty, you can drink it really fast. There's a little bit more water getting away than I would have liked here. Of course, the main thing we do, that we're trying to do up there, is science. And so there's a lot of different experiments. A majority of them are looking at human physiology and how the body adapts to zero-G. This happens to be a European centrifuge that would allow plant and animal tissue to be grown in different gravity fields. So anywhere from 0-G, which is obviously not spinning, up until 2Gs, and then they could look at the results and compare them to the different accelerations that were being sensed. The second thing was a group of artificial satellites that were using cold gas, carbon dioxide, to maneuver themselves. The third thing with the laptop was a reaction test that we took periodically. And here I'm taking a blood sample, because one thing that's really interesting and fairly well understood is that the body goes through changes. There's a lot of things especially to do with calcium and what happens to your bone density. And so we would do these blood and urine samples at periods along the way. This is a freezer where we stowed them because we didn't have the equipment to analyze the samples on board. This freezer is at 100 degrees below zero, also provided by ESA, if I'm not mistaken. And then finally, it's just a little few images of doing spacewalks. This is really an amazing activity. I think Krista will agree. It's quite special to be orbiting the Earth. You know, you're traveling 8 kilometers a second at about 400 kilometers above. But if you let go, nothing really changes. In other words, you don't go. It's not like 8 kilometers per second when you stick your hand out the window in your car. Pretty magical feeling. And then just a couple of views of the Earth. This is obviously sped up a little bit, but you get an idea of what the perspective is like. This is obviously the Middle East. We just flew over the Red Sea and the Sinai Peninsula there off to your left. The views are pretty spectacular during the day, but maybe even more so at night. I'll try to orient you here. This is, we're looking southeast. This is London. This is Paris. So this is the English Channel, and just keep an eye on all that as we go. You can see Italy pretty clearly lit on the right as we pass. And there's we're flying over Turkey now. That was Cyprus. Happens pretty quick. Obviously, again, this is a little bit sped up. What's really interesting here is you can start to see, in this next clip, you can see some thunderstorms down below at first, these little pops of light that you'll see. And then at the end, it's a pretty spectacular view of something that you see around here more than we do, and that is the aurora. Okay, so that sort of brings us up to date, and I'd like to talk a little bit about commercial spaceflight, because I think that's what you wanted to hear about. So first, it's a little bit tricky when you say commercial, because a lot of people have used that word in many different ways, and there's not a very, let's say, rigid definition. But this is how we talk about the commercial spaceflight industry. We say that it's self-identified, so that means that you either call yourself a commercial spaceflight company or you're not a commercial spaceflight company. You could still be doing that sort of thing, but it's sort of an identity that's grown up lately. Any company that's doing commercial human spaceflight is sort of in the club, but it also includes companies that are not doing human spaceflight, and I'll talk about a couple of them later. But through their business practices, which is we call here spaceflight innovation, is a little bit different way from the traditional method of government space. One thing to note, it does not include commercial satellite operations. So they're commercial for sure. They're obviously not human, but they're sort of more traditional in how they're launched and operated. So by these business practices, let me just give you a few characteristics. The first is that the development is done by the private sector with their own design. So in the U.S., NASA traditionally would hire a contractor to build, let's say, the space shuttle or Apollo or something, and they would really lead the design and be involved at every step. The contractor would just sort of provide the manpower, the expertise, the engineering talent, the bodies. But the program management was all run within NASA. This is different. NASA has said, in the case that I'll get into a little bit more, we would like a vehicle that does this sort of thing, and we want you to build it. Of course, they're involved in the process a little bit, but not in the decision-making day-to-day. And what that does is allows a contractor to be able to make their decisions much more quickly. Second thing is there's private investment. So in the first case, contractors just being paid basically by the hour. So the more they work, the longer they work, the more they get paid. So they have no incentive to do things quickly. They just get paid sort of whether they're producing or not. When you have private investment, of course, time is money in business, and so they want to accelerate things. The systems are designed to serve more than just the government as a customer. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. This is really important. The contracts are what they call fixed price milestone based. So rather than this model where they just sort of be paid by the hour, they are paid at certain intervals when they produce something. It could be a test, it could be a piece of hardware, it could just be analysis, but it is a very defined thing. When they hand that to the government and the government's satisfied that it's been accomplished, they call that complete, and then they're paid. They can also, so this is all development I'm talking about, they can also purchase services and data that way, which is not all that unusual. When if the government wants to go buy computers, they're not going to invent a computer. They're just going to go buy something from from Apple or from a Microsoft vendor. But the same is true of launch services or data. And again, all of this definition is not driven by how big or small or new or old the company is. It's just by how they're thinking about this. So why is commercial spaceflight important? The first thing is what we call a democratization of space. If you look back at the 1930s, when commercial aviation in the U.S. took off, in a similar way, the government subsidized the carriers by allowing them to, by writing contracts with them to carry the mail. And as that became more and more routine and more profitable, the companies were able to use the expertise that they got in delivering the mail to design airplanes that would carry people. And if you look at the amount of people, passengers per that have flown per year since back then, you can see, I mean, obviously over today we're over 600 million passengers. So that's an amazing growth. And we're looking to try to repeat something along the same shape in commercial spaceflight. Right now, we've had, if you add all those numbers up, including 2010s, or the 2000s, I should say, the total number of people in space has been 536. Now, these numbers here reflect trips into space, so some people, like me, are counted twice. But 536 people have actually orbited the Earth. If you look at a couple of the companies in the commercial spaceflight industry in the U.S. today, Virgin Galactic, X-Core Aerospace, that want to do suborbital flight, they have double that many people already signed up to fly with them. So this is the democratization of space, and this is just sort of a teaser about what they might look like, or what a flight like that might look like. And there's a lightning that I thought was in the other video, but it's in this one. And that is a moonrise, not a sunrise. Second, why would we do commercial space? We're trying to lower the cost. And getting into space is extremely expensive because it's a very demanding environment. The materials have to be very high performing. The processes have to be very repeatable, very high quality. And so everything is very expensive. So by increasing the flight rate with this virtuous cycle, you can actually bring the cost down, which will in turn make the flight rate increase, which will in turn make the cost come down, and you get in this virtuous cycle. So if you look in the upper right-hand corner, astronaut flights to the ISS through the Commercial Crew Program, which I'll get into in a second, and then private suborbital tourism, which I'll also talk about, mean higher flight rates. Higher flight rates means the marginal costs go down. So basically the price to get to orbit goes down. The reduction in price causes an increase in demand. The increase in demand causes an increase in the flight rate, and you can see the circle that ensues. And so these are the things that we are trying to do here. First, scientific research flights, satellite launches someday, national security missions maybe, and also flights by individual citizens, which we're calling tourism. These are sort of the milestone dates of how this industry developed in the U.S. In 1984, Ronald Reagan signed this Commercial Space Launch Act, and he wanted to, quote, encourage, facilitate, and promote the industry in the United States. And what that did was it set a very different mindset from the kinds of things that are often regulated in the U.S. I'll talk a little bit more about regulation. But it established what they call a licensing regime, not a certification regime. So an airplane, a commercial airplane in the U.S. is certificated by the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and basically it's a government stamp of approval that says this airplane is safe to fly, and you, Mr. Passenger, when you get on it, can be reasonably assured that we, the government, have done our best to make sure this is all, that you're going to land when you take off. Commercial space travel is much riskier, it's much more difficult, and if there was that kind of regulation right from the beginning, nobody would do it because it would be too expensive, too hazardous. So a licensing regime under what they call informed consent allows a spaceflight participant to make the decision themselves, and the FAA has a different role, which is not to protect the occupant, but it's to protect third parties, so public safety and property. That was in 1984. In 1996, something called the X Prize was established. Could somebody fly a vehicle to 100 kilometers, which is considered the edge of space, and back twice within 2 weeks with 3 people aboard? 8 years later, Spaceship One, which is designed, which looks a lot like what Virgin is flying today, won the Ansari X Prize from Mojave. And in the same year, in anticipation of these of the advent of commercial space industry for people, they passed the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act, which took basically the language from the Commercial Space Launch Act about encourage, facilitating, and promoting, and now it made it applicable not just to unmanned launches, but to human launches as well. And it established a learning period by saying, we don't want you, the FAA, to get too much involved with the regulation of this industry yet. We want you to we want you to take care of the public safety, but if somebody wants to fly, like I mentioned before, under the informed consent regime, they could. So that's kind of a history of sort of how we got to where we are. Let me tell you where we are right now, quickly. You can divide the commercial space world in a couple different ways. One way of looking at it is the realms, like where are you going? The first place is near space. This is Felix Baumgartner, who decided to jump out of a perfectly good balloon at 128,000 feet. That's not really commercial spaceflight, but this might be commercial spaceflight. This was a a venture that was just announced about a month ago. This is obviously a simulation, you'll see it's an animation, but it's a company that pretends to take people not into space, but to an altitude of about 30 kilometers in what is effectively a balloon. So they like to say, rather than a big ball of fire, it uses a big ball of helium. But you would launch, and this is very different from suborbital tourism, which is very dynamic. So you have rockets firing, you have a lot of G's, you have a lot of G's as you're climbing, and then you 0 G for a while, and then you have a lot of G's when you come back. This is meant to be sort of a peaceful, sophisticated way to do it. So you could be drinking champagne during this instead of holding on to for dear life. What's interesting is that the FAA decided that they would regulate these as a commercial space company, even though they're not going to space, which is a very important decision, because that allows them to avoid a lot of the regulatory hurdles that they would have to under a normal ballooning company. But the fact that they go so high and their vehicle has to be effectively space qualified, there's virtually no atmosphere at 30 kilometers, they decided that they would regulate them that way. I'll skip to the end, but you can see the balloon is released at some point, and then it comes back with a parafoil to a glided landing. Then there's suborbital space. Suborbital space, as I mentioned, is basically you go up and you go up and you come straight back to the place you landed. There are two major companies involved. One of them is called X-Core Aerospace. This is their vehicle. It's called Lynx, and Lynx is a single stage to orbit, or to suborbit in this case. So it basically takes off horizontally from a runway, lands back on the same runway. It has no pieces that it gets rid of. What's interesting about their technology is they have a piston-driven pump, both to pump the oxidizer, which is liquid oxygen, and the fuel, which is basically a very high-grade jet fuel. So it's relatively easily available. And what they think is that they can actually use this kind of pump system and have very minimum maintenance required. So instead of so the space shuttle was reusable, but every time we landed, they had to do a major refurbishment of each of those engines, which took many, many weeks to accomplish. In this case, they literally think they can fly the same vehicle 4 times a day. So they take off, they land, they come back, they put fuel in it just like a commercial airliner, and off they go. So the profile is you take off from the runway with those 4 engines lit, you go vertical, the engine burns for about 1 minute. When the engine stops burning, of course you're going up at about 3 times the speed of sound, straight up. And so at that point you're going to coast pretty high to an apogee, which is just above 100 kilometers. They want originally to operate, they're doing their test flights in Mojave, which is in California, but eventually hope to operate elsewhere around the world. They have the modality is that they have, it's a pretty small vehicle, so there's a pilot on the left side and the passenger on the right side. The passenger could be just up there for the view, or he could be executing some kind of a payload, which could be in his seat, behind his seat, or under his seat, and if he has to interact with it. So their ticket prices for this are $95,000, which is not cheap, but it's a pretty unique experience, and there is a lot of evidence that shows that there are a lot of people who have that kind of money that are willing to spend it to do this kind of an adventure. After the period of 0 G, which lasts about 3 to 5 minutes, the vehicle comes back down to the same place that it took off from and lands also like a glider on the runway. The second entry is Virgin Galactic. This is based on the Spaceship One design, which won the Ansari X Prize. It was designed by a aviation sort of legend named Burt Rutan. This is a montage of it's not an animation, it's actually a powered flight. So they are actually flying this vehicle today. Now what you see here is that this is a different, it's not single stage to orbit. It has, you could call it a mothership called White Knight 2 is a large twin fuselage airplane with Spaceship 2, the small one in the middle, being taken up. It climbs, it takes quite a while to climb up to about 50,000 feet or so. Inside the spaceship are 2 pilots in the front, and in the back there's 6 passengers. The passengers are seated, strapped in for takeoff, obviously for landing, but in the zero-G portion they'll be able to actually float around. And you can see this is actually what it looks like when they drop it and they light the engine. They haven't actually gone all the way to space with this vehicle, but they have flown it a couple of times with the engine lit for about 15 and 20 seconds respectively. Again, it's about 1 minute of burn time, so it's pretty similar profile once they release it. And you'll see another unique feature about this, and that is that the tail portion actually folds. Look here at the angle between the tail and the fuselage. So the empennage actually rotates up, and it enters the Earth's atmosphere in what they call a shuttlecock, like a badminton shuttlecock. And the reason for doing that is it takes the pilot out of the loop. It's sort of hands-off, very simple to fly. Once they make it through re-entry, they stow the empennage back in its normal place, and it becomes just another glider and comes in for a landing. So tickets for this adventure are $200,000. They have a purpose-built spaceport in New Mexico where they plan to do their operations, although likewise they're doing their test flights from the Mojave Air and Spaceport in California. On the orbital side, we have really all the commercial space in the orbital side is focused on NASA's Commercial Crew Program. So there are 3 main entrants left. One of them is Boeing. This is the CST-100 capsule. One of them is SpaceX. This is the Dragon capsule. And the third one is Sierra Nevada Corporation with something based on a lifting body called the Dream Chaser. So those are sort of the 3 transportation companies that are involved. There's a 4th company that is Bigelow Aerospace that is doing inflatable technology. So they actually, this is an artist's picture, but they actually have 2 inflatable habitats that are orbiting the Earth right now that they launched from Russia called Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And their idea is that once the orbital transportation market establishes itself, they want to be the destination. So let me talk a little bit about the Commercial Crew Program. In 2004, then President Bush announced his vision for space exploration, which included finishing construction of the ISS, retiring the space shuttle, and having another program called Constellation, which was going to go back to the moon one day with 2 different rockets, a capsule, and a lander. In 2009, after the following election, the new president hired a group to examine how Constellation was going, and they reported that Constellation was sick. They were behind schedule and over budget. And so in the 2010 and then 2011 budget proposal, NASA and really the president requested the cancellation be canceled and that the Commercial Crew Program be stood up. It was an unfortunate timing because the 2 really didn't have much to do with each other, although arguably they were using some of the same money. But this was a sort of a watershed moment for Commercial Crew Program. And then finally in the authorization, which is the legislation that sort of tells NASA what to do for the next 3 years, they sort of reincarnated Constellation with a different name, and Commercial Crew Program still survives. So that's kind of the détente that we're in right now, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second. Again, this is a Russian Soyuz. This is the only way we have to get to the ISS right now, and we want to have these 3 companies that are competing produce 1 or maybe 2 systems that'll take us there. So again, it's a public-private partnership. It uses something called a Space Act Agreement, which is a little bit different from a regular contract. Regular contract in the U.S. falls under something called Federal Acquisition Regulations, which are very cumbersome and very demanding on the contractor. Not very efficient because they require a lot of money and effort to be spent on things that don't really produce a product. And the Space Act agreements are firm fixed price and they're milestone based like we discussed before. The commercial partners have investment. I won't read you all the details about the phases, but right now they're in the very end of what they call CCICAP, Commercial Crew Integrated Capability, which gets them to a point which is equivalent to critical design review, and that has to happen by the middle of next year. Then the follow-on phase will pick, of the three, they may pick only one, they may pick two, they could pick all three to continue to an actual flight test. And there you see operational capability. NASA's saying 2017. The companies say if you give us more money, we could do it in 2015. But what's important here is it's not just to develop this thing to take ISS astronauts to the ISS. It's also to develop this transportation system that other users might use. So other users could be, again, they could be private citizens that want to go up there for an experience, or they could be companies or research organizations, academic institutions that have a particular need to go to the ISS to use the incredible laboratory facility that has become a national lab, meaning it is open, it is available for commercial and private use for research. You just have to get there. And then someday the idea is that we would actually generate a whole economy in low Earth orbit with not just transportation, but also a destination to go. And that could be for, again, it could be for tourism, it could be for a laboratory in space, it could be for foreign sovereign nations that want to have their own space station. And in the end, you'll see the picture on the right is the idea that Bigelow would like to get to. There are a few companies involved in beyond low Earth orbit exploration. One of them is looking for asteroids to try to exploit their resources. Obviously, that's a little bit in the future. This is a telescope that would be searching for those kinds of asteroids. And this represents another company called Golden Spike that wants to actually sell trips to the moon to countries. So a country that's sort of in a tier of countries that has a space program but doesn't have maybe an astronaut program or a human capability would be able to purchase this adventure or this journey to go and plant their own flag on the moon. So lastly, before I leave this, the way of breaking this down by looking at the different realms, I want to talk a little bit about spaceports. So we have 8 or 9 established spaceports in the U.S. These actually have a license from the FAA to do operations. There are another list of about 8 that are interested in becoming spaceports, and they're in some part of the process to become one. Then there's some international spaceports, and I think I'd like to spend 1 minute at least talking about Spaceport Sweden, which is on this list. This is a list of the services that they provide or will provide. A spaceflight preparation program, it's basically astronaut training. That's done Linkopig, not far from here. Kinetic is sort of the company that runs all this. There's a centrifuge, there's a hyperbaric chamber, and they take the astronaut candidates through that kind of training. They would like to do Northern Lights flights from Kiruna in conjunction with the Swedish Institute of Space Physics. They also have a partnership with Novaspace to do zero-G flights. These are parabolic flights in a modified Airbus out of Bordeaux. And then someday, maybe Virgin, maybe Excor, maybe Worldview, the balloon company will be here. And if you want to know more about that, you can ask Karin Nilsdotter, who's the CEO of Spaceport Sweden, and it's right there. The other way of looking at it is, are we carrying humans or are we carrying science and technology? This is just to show you that it's not all human spaceflight. This is a vertical takeoff, vertical landing science and technology demonstrated by a company called Maston Aerospace that does a lot of payloads for software, guidance, navigation, and control for entry, descent, and landing for JPL, for Mars landings. And then finally, people. So in 1 more minute, I just want to show you that this is not just a lot of PowerPoint presentations and pretty pictures. This is actually happening. And here's some data from a study that I just literally got last week about what's going on in the U.S. In this industry. So there are about 110 companies that are involved in the commercial spaceflight industry in the U.S. And this is a breakdown by what part of that industry they're in, whether it's engineering technical support services, which you see as a lion's share, spaceflight providers, meaning vehicle makers, either orbital or suborbital, lunar or beyond LEO, and then spaceports. This is a revenue. You can see from 2006, a little over 100 million, and approaching 800 million now in 2012. And this is investment. So this is not what's being money that's being earned, but rather money that's being put into it. And this number is now cumulative up to $2.5 billion of investment in this industry in the U.S. since its inception. And you can see that the vast majority are by individuals, not very much by government, although it's present. Finally, employment, about 6,000 people are involved, and that's a worldwide number, 6,000 people across the globe involved in commercial spaceflight. I'll touch on these briefly, but you know, the NASA law that I mentioned that stood up the commercial crew program and tried to cancel the Constellation program started a little bit of a fight in the U.S. between traditional companies and new space companies. I think we're beyond that now, but since we do compete for some of the same NASA funding, that is a bit of an issue. Funding of the commercial crew program, one thing that's very important for this type of business is competition. And if we only have enough funding to fund one of those three companies that are left, it's going to be, I think that's going to sort of perturb the process. I would really like to see them be able to fund two, and for that we need to have a little bit more robust funding profile than we have been indicated we'll receive. Lots to talk about in terms of regulation. I don't think I want to talk too much about any of this except maybe the European certification. Europe doesn't have a plan right now about how they're going to regulate this industry. They don't know if they want to do certification or licensing. And I think basically the question is on hold. But we're very interested in having the answer be licensing and not certification. Certification is a very difficult, tedious, painstaking, slow, bureaucratic process. And I'm afraid that the kinds of stifling of innovation that we tried very hard to avoid in the U.S. would take hold here, not to mention in future when we have suborbital point-to-point commercial spaceflight, it'll be difficult to mesh the two regimes if one of them on one side of the ocean is licensing and the other one is certification. Export control reform, we had a pretty big piece of legislation pass at the end of last year that at least opened the door for export control reform, but there is a lot to be done yet, and the devil is in the details, as they say. Okay, I had a video I was going to show, but I think in view of the time, why don't I open it up to any of you that might have any questions?
While you think if you have a question, and you may know that there are mics on the side of the seats. I have one question there. In principle, I guess the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, is it an international organization or a U.S. organization?
Well,
and do you have any international members?
We have only one international member, which is Canadian, MDA. And it is a registered, I don't know if these will be anything, 501c6, that is a part of the tax code, that it's a certain type of nonprofit organization. So we're not a company, we're a nonprofit trade association. Our job is to make the lives of our members better by addressing some of those issues that I showed on the last slide. So we are interested in expanding, particularly to Europe, particularly because of this pending regulation sort of debate that's happening. And, you know, I think a logical destination, particularly for some of these suborbital companies that want to do business abroad, will be Europe, because that's where a lot of their clients live. And since it's a straight up and straight down flight, you want to see a different part of the world than just New Mexico.
Like Aurora's in Kiruna.
Perhaps Aurora's in Kiruna.
Any questions from the audience before we go to the coffee break? They're just stunned, everyone. it's 3 o'clock sharp. Oh, there's a question. You have a mic there on the side, on the seat, and you can use that. Push a button to get a red light on.
Yeah, obviously the US has gone very far in space technology here. And I kind of wonder if there is any indication if there are any other industrial interest in the space technology than communication. I mean, so far we've seen different kinds of communication going into space, but are there any other kind of industrial sectors, so to say, that have shown some interest?
I think the one that I hear a lot about is the pharmaceutical industry, because there are certain advantages. First of all, in drug delivery systems in zero-G processing, and so many of the. Let me say a little bit about the International Space Station has a national lab designation, which, as I mentioned, means that companies or nonprofits or academic institutions can actually use the facilities on board. They could just send the experiments up, or ultimately they could send an investigator to go with them. A lot of the companies that are interested in using that are pharmaceutical companies for the reasons that I mentioned. And they get to keep the intellectual property that they develop on there. And again, the idea is that if they find a process or maybe a manufacturing technique that is specific to zero-G and it's profitable enough, it's so efficient that it makes it profitable, then they could be in the potentially be purchasing some kind of a habitat away from the ISS, having their own sort of laboratory in space. So I guess the pharma world is the one that I hear most about.
Yes.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. You showed a diagram where you showed the funding of the commercial space program, and it was mainly individuals. But you had a slice of governmental funding. Is it only U.S. government, or do you have that spread out over other governments as well?
Well, I think that slide was U.S. only. I think the only slide that had international, took into account the global picture was the employment slide. And the vast majority of that is in the U.S. as well.
Oh, okay. Let's have 2 more questions. One there, and then one there, and then we go to coffee.
Your vision or thoughts of sort of using the commercial strong powers to get the cost down, to get people up in space is extremely interesting. Do you think this will have implications on other parts of the space industry, for instance, putting satellites in orbit?
Well, I think it has already. In the U.S., let's say globally, there's the launch market. There aren't that many launch providers. So there's it's a U.S.-Russian company called ILS. There's Arianespace. There's a company in the U.S. called United Launch Alliance. The Chinese have one. But so we're talking 4 or 5. It's a pretty small number. One of the companies that's involved in commercial crew program that is now participating in something I didn't talk about, which is a commercial cargo program, is SpaceX. So they have developed, with a small amount of government investment and some of their own launcher, which has demonstrated the ability to take cargo to the ISS. That same vehicle is now going to be marketed in the commercial satellite launch business and will become a competitor. And their prices that they are advertising are quite a bit lower. It is thought that the reason that they can be so competitive price-wise is because they are very vertically integrated, meaning that they don't have very many suppliers, so they bring literally sheet metal in one end of the hangar and rockets come out the other. And if you can control those costs and schedules, etc., it's thought that that's an efficient, effective way to do things. So if they can enter the market, and the problem is a lot of these other companies have long success histories. SpaceX has only been around for a few years and they've only had a handful of flights. So if you're a satellite operator, it might be pretty attractive to go spend a lot less money on this, but then you have to look at the track record and just, see what the risk analysis is for your company. I think once that becomes proven that they are a real reliable launcher, then you'll see, I think, a change in the landscape in the launch market.
Last question, Oscar.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for a very good presentation. It's very
You're
interesting. I was wondering, you talked about the democratization of access to space. Do you think that's feasible for, let's say, ordinary humans, like people that make reasonable amounts of money per year, to have access to space with a non-reusable space vehicle or launch system?
Oh, well, that's interesting. I'm not an economist, but I think that reusability is the key to bringing the cost down. And so, we've been flying to space for about 50 years now, and what seems to be different now is that we're getting more and more, particularly in the suborbital world, more and more reusability. And that's really where I think the first democratization will take place. It's still quite expensive to fly to orbit. There's still unsatisfied demand. Somebody just signed a contract last year to go to the ISS on a Russian vehicle and spend a week or so. But the real breakthrough is going to be made in the suborbital world. And I do think that, again, like the graph that I showed back in the 30s, back in the day it was very, very expensive for people to fly commercially on an airplane too. And somebody might have said, is it going to be ever reasonable for a normal person to do it? Well, obviously it is today. And the hope is that that will be true for space as well. But I think reusability is important.
Well, Mike is around for the coffee and also a meal afterwards. So
Sure.
Say thank you, Mike, and thanks
You're
a
welcome.
lot. Great.